We're going to look at Kivy in this video, which allows you to build cross-platform applications using Python. And Kivy runs on different platforms, for example iOS, Android, Linux, macOS and Windows. So you can write the code in Python and you can deploy to any of these target platforms. And this is quite similar to 𝗏𝗏, which we looked at previously. And what we're going to do in this video is build a small quiz application using Kivy. So this is going to be a super simple quiz application. As we see on the right hand side, we have the question at the top and we can select answers and we get the message incorrect or correct depending on what we choose. And we can navigate through to the different questions in the quiz until we get to the final question, and then we get this quiz completed page. Now we're not going to focus on the styling too much here, more on the functionality of Kivy, and we're also going to look at the template language that's built into the framework. And this language allows us to define our user interface in this declarative way, and we can nest different widgets inside of other widgets and give them properties and so on. So we'll see all of that in this video. So that's what we're going to build. Let's get started. Before we do so, if you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page. We've got a link to that just below the video, and we've also opened channel memberships if you want to join the channel and support this content. Now let's get started. We're going to go to the Kivy documentation here, and it can be quite overwhelming at first, but we're going to break this down, and this is going to be quite a long video, but we are going to build something that is quite simple, but it's going to be a fairly useful application. Now if we go to the programming guide, there's a good section here on the basics. And of course we need to install Kivy to get started, but we're going to do that later on. Let's just have a look at creating an application at the moment. So it's very simple to create a Kivy application. We just subclass this app class that we have from Kivy. And then inside that class, we implement a build method, and that should return a widget instance, and that's going to be the root of the widget tree. So the user interface that you build with Kivy is going to have multiple widgets, and they're going to be arranged in a hierarchical tree-like structure, just like HTML or React components, for example. And that all starts with the root component, and that's what should be returned by this build method. Now to get started, what I want to do is just copy all of this code, and I'm going to open up VS Code and paste this into a main.py file. And I'm also going to remove this statement here, we don't need that, and we can move the imports to the top. Once we've added the code, we're going to install Kivy, and we're going to go over this code and then run it. So if we scroll back up here, we can install on different platforms. For example, I'm on Windows at the moment, and we're going to install Kivy using pip. We can also do this with UV if you're using that. So let's go to the section on pip, and we're going to copy this command that we have down here. So we're installing the Kivy base package. So let's copy that, and inside a Python virtual environment on the terminal here, we're going to execute that command and install Kivy and all its dependencies. Now let's clear the terminal and let's go over what we have here. So we defined a class called myApp, and we're subclassing this app class that we have from Kivy. And then we define the build method that we saw in the documentation, and that is returning a label widget. So from kivy.uix, we can import a set of widgets. And this is going to be a super simple app. It's only going to have one widget, which is a label, and that text is going to say hello world. Now in the main block here, we are running the application. So we take the class, we instantiate it, and then we call the .run method. Now this method on a Kivy app class is going to launch the application in standalone mode. Now let's try executing this. So we're going to run python main.py inside this virtual environment. So main.py, it's going to bring up the application, and that's appeared on my other screen. So I'm going to drag that across here, and you can see this application. We have a single widget, that's the label widget that says hello world. Not the most exciting app, but that is enough to get started, and we can close this window, and you can see at the bottom the application has exited. So this is super simple. We have a class, it's a subclass of Kivy's app, and we instantiate that class and call its run method. Now before we start building our own application, let's go back here and let's go to the section on customizing the application, and let's copy all of this code and go back to VS Code and paste that in, and let's just run this and see what happens. So python main.py, and if I bring that over to the right hand side, you can see we now have a slightly more complex app. Not the best looking thing, but we can customize that as well with Kivy. But we have a username and a password field, and we can type into these boxes. So how is that working? Let's go back to the code. So we define a class here called login screen, and that is a subclass of grid layout, and that is a class that comes from kivy.uix.gridlayout. And this allows you to arrange things into grids. For example, you can define the number of columns on the grid layout. And then to the grid layout, we can call the add widget method to add certain widgets, for example, labels, text inputs, and the text input is what we see here that we can actually type into. So that's another example of a widget. And we have a password field here that is also a text input with password set to true. And what that means is that it obscures the text that you type in. So we cannot actually see what the user's password is. So that's another example here. And then what we do is we create the myApp class. That's a subclass of Kivy's app. And in the build method, we simply return our login screen class, which is this one up here. So that's how we can arrange things into grids. And let's go back to the documentation and scroll down. I'll leave a link to this just below the video if you want to read into everything that's in that documentation. Now, one thing to note is that when we define a class like this that subclasses a widget such as grid layout, you can override the _init method. And as the documentation says, when you do that, you can add widgets and define their behavior. So the place to do that is in this _init method. Now, one last thing I want to highlight before we start building the quiz application is the Kivy language for defining a user interface. So let's click this link here on the left-hand side on the Kivy language. And the rationale behind this is that as your application grows more complex, it's common that the construction of widget trees and explicit declaration of bindings becomes very verbose and difficult to maintain. So the Kivy language is an attempt to overcome these shortcomings, and it allows you to create your widget trees in a declarative way, and we're going to do that in this video. Now, if we scroll down here, we can maybe see an example of how to do this. So here we have the Kivy language, and this is going to make a lot more sense when we actually build the quiz application and do this practically. But basically we have the widgets defined here, and we have this nested structure that tells you the layout on the page. So here we have a widget called myRootWidget, which in turn contains a box layout, and that box layout contains 2 buttons. So that's the declarative Kivy language, and it's equivalent to this in Python, where you define the root widget and then the box layout, and then you can add to the box layout 2 buttons, as you can see here, and finally you can add that box layout to the root. But it's a little bit harder to see what the actual hierarchy is here compared to this Kivy language. So that's the rationale. As you build complex interfaces, it's much easier to see the widget declarations in this Kivy language and to see the hierarchy on the user interface. Now, as I said, we're going to see much more examples of that in this video. We can also set properties on these widgets. For example, for the grid layout, we can set the number of columns, and here it's set to 3. Now, I think some introduction is necessary before we start building the application, but I do want to get started now. So we're going to build a small quiz application, the one that we saw in the introduction. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm just going to remove most of this code. In fact, let's remove all of it. And I'm going to go to questions.py to start with. So we have a set of questions that I've defined here for the quiz. And of course, in a real application, these would be coming from a database or some other source, but they wouldn't be hard-coded probably. So 3 questions. What is the capital of France? That's question 1. And here we have some options, which is a Python list. And here we have the correct answer, and we have a couple of extra questions as well. Now what we're going to do in main.py is build the Kivy application, and we're going to import these questions as well. So I'm going to paste some boilerplate code just to get started. We're importing that app class. That's the one we need to subclass to create a Kivy application. We import the questions as well, and we define this block. Now for the quiz, we're going to extend this class here. It's the box layout. Now you can define a box layout horizontally or vertically. You can see the vertical layout on the right hand side, and there is the horizontal layout as well. Now we are going to have a vertical box layout because we want to display the question text at the top. Underneath that we want to display the options, and then finally after the user selects an option, we want to display whether or not they are correct and give them the option to move on to the next question. So that's all going to be vertical on this user interface. So what I want to do is define a class that subclasses the box layout. Let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to do that to get started. So it's going to be called quiz_screen, and that's going to be a subclass of box layout, and we do need to import that from Kivy. So at the top here, from the uix.boxLayout module, we can import that class. And then inside the quiz screen class, we can override the _init method, and that'll take self and the keyword arguments, and then we can define some of the properties of this widget. Now, one of the important things we always need to do when we subclass something from Kivy is to call the super.init method, and that's going to perform some of the setup code. So we pass the keyword arguments into that, and then after we've done that, let's create an instance variable called self.questions, and we're going to set that to the questions that we imported here on line 4. So that is the very basic class that we have here for the quiz screen. We're also going to create a second class for the actual application. So that's going to be called quiz app. And this is going to be our subclass of the Kivy app object, which is the entry point to the application. And then of course, as we saw before, we define that build method. And what we're going to return from the build method is the root widget in this application, which is going to be the quiz screen. So let's instantiate the quiz screen. And the final step here to get this running is to actually instantiate the quiz app and call the run method. So let's save this. And what I'm going to do is clear the terminal, and we can run python main.py at the bottom here. And that's going to create this application. And here we have the application. At the moment, we don't see anything, and that's because we don't actually define any user interface components here. All we're doing in the quiz screen is storing the questions as an instance variable. So not the most interesting application just now, but we're going to move on and start defining some widgets in this user interface. So there's a few concepts we need to cover here. One of them is a property in Kivy. So let's go to this page on properties. Kivy has introduced a new way of declaring properties within a class. So here's an example where we have a class here and a numeric variable, and we instantiate a numeric property and give it a default value. Now these properties are different from normal Python instance variables because they implement the observer pattern, and they also allow you to easily manipulate widgets in the Kv language. And they also automatically observe any changes and dispatch functions and code accordingly. And they also have some check and validation rules and memory management optimizations built in. Now we declared these at the class level. They're not declared as instance variables within the dunder init method. And we have various properties, for example, numeric property, string property, and so on. So what I'm going to do is define the question text, and that is going to be a string property. So let's go to the top here and let's import the string property. And don't worry if this is a bit weird at the moment, hopefully it's going to make sense very soon. Inside the quiz screen, we're now going to create that class level variable. It's going to be called question_text, and that is going to be an instance of the string property. Now ultimately we're going to control this UI with the Kv language, so we're going to see that soon. Once we have the question text, we're going to define another method on this class, and that's going to be a method called loadQuestion. So essentially what this is going to do is determine which question is shown on the Kivy application. But for now, we're going to hard code this. The question is going to be equal to self.questions, and we're going to get the very first question out of that list by indexing in at 0. Now once we have that, we're going to set the question text. So self.questionText, and this is referring to the string property on line 9. The loadQuestion method is going to set that, and it's going to be equal to this here. So we're going to take the question that we got from the list here above, and we're going to index in and get the question. Now to make this make sense, let's go back here. So each element in this list here is a dictionary, and each one contains a key called question that refers to the actual text content of the question. There are also keys for the options and the correct answer. So all we're doing with this line of code here is we're getting the one at index 0, which refers to this dictionary. And then this line here is setting the text to what we have here. So it's what is the capital of France. We're hard coding that at the moment, but later on we're going to allow the user to navigate through the application. And what we're also going to do is we're going to take the question that we have here, and we're going to create a button for each one of these options. So we need to get the key of options in this dictionary. So let's do that just now. And I'm actually going to create a for loop here. So for option, and we're going to get the question that we have above, and we're going to access its options by indexing in at the options. And for each one of these, we're going to create a button widget. So let's instantiate that button. Now we do need to import this. So let's go to the top here, and I'm going to paste this import in. So we're importing the button widget from kivy.uix.button. And what we can do with the button is we can pass some options to that. So we're going to set the text to the option that we have in the for loop. And we can also set some properties here. For example, size hint y, we're going to set to none. And let's set an explicit height for the button to 50. Now what this is doing here is it's going to tell Kivy not to automatically calculate the height of the button. That's necessary if you want to set a fixed height, as we're doing here. So we're setting this to 50 pixels. That's the height of the button. Now once we have these buttons, what we're going to do is add them to another box layout. And we're going to define this in the Kv language. So that's coming up in a second, but what we want to do just to finish this section of the video is we want to call self.loadQuestion, and that's in the dunder init method when the instance is created. So with that, we want to now define the Kv template language. So we're going to create a new file here called quiz.kv. Notice that extension here of .kv. Now to understand this better, let's go to the documentation on the Kv design language. So Kivy provides this design language that's specifically geared towards easy and scalable GUI design. Now the idea behind this is to separate the interface design from the application logic, and therefore you adhere to the separation of concerns principle. And that is how something like this example on the left hand side can become this layout and interface on the right. Now what we can note here is that from the code, we have our login screen here, and every class that we have in our application can be represented by a rule like this in the Kv file. And then inside the login screen, we have another widget here, and that's indented across. It's the grid layout. So notice that indentation, that is how we nest a child widget inside of a parent widget, and then we can have properties as well. For example, for the grid layout, we can have a number of rows and columns that represent that grid, in this case 2 rows. So what we're going to start doing is creating our own user interface here in the quiz.kv file. So the class that we had that represented the root component was this one here called quiz_screen. So let's go back to the kv file and we're going to reference that component now. And we can add properties to that. So for example, I could add an orientation here of vertical. So let's set this to the value vertical here. And that quiz screen, remember, if we go back here, was a subclass of the box layout. And if we remember from the documentation, the box layout with the vertical orientation allows us to stack elements on top of each other. And we also have the horizontal layout. Now let's go back to the kv file. What do we want to show on the quiz screen? Now at the top of the screen, I want to show a label. And that is going to display the actual text for the question. So let's give this an ID, and that is going to be something we can reference inside our application logic. So we're going to give it an ID here of question label, and we'll give it the actual text value for the label, and that's going to be equal to something called root.question_text. Now this is a bit confusing, but let's go over this. Root refers to the quiz screen itself, and if we refer to a property here called question text, let's go back to main.py and notice that it refers to this here, and this was the string property we set up on the quiz screen. So this is an example of how we can map these properties on the classes that we have in our Kivy applications to values that we can use inside of the .kv file when we define our user interface. And underneath this label, we're going to define another widget, and that's going to be a second box layout. And I say second because remember the quiz screen at the top is actually a subclass of box layout. And I want to give this the orientation of vertical. And what we're actually going to show underneath the question text is a set of buttons that are going to display the options for each question. For example, the question, what is the capital of France? We have 4 options here, and we want a button for each one, and the user should be able to click that button to actually select an answer. So we need to have a box layout with vertical orientation, and that's because we want to stack those options on top of each other vertically. Now, like the label widget we had above, we're going to define an ID for the box layout. So let's do that just now. And let's call this options box. And again, by giving it an ID, we can actually refer to it inside our Python file here. And we're going to do that very soon. And finally, for this box layout, I'm going to add a spacing property and set that to 10 pixels. And that's going to add some spacing between each option that we have in this box layout. So how do we actually reference the box layout now? So what we're going to do next is we're going to take these buttons that we're adding here, and remember we're doing this inside a for loop for each option that we have for the question. We want to take this button now and add it to the box layout that we have here with the ID of options box. So I'm going to copy the name of this ID because we are going to reference this now, and then underneath this comment, let's now add each button to the box layout. Now what we can do is we can use a property called self.ids, and if we hover over that, as it says here, this self.ids is a dictionary of IDs that are defined in our KV language, and it's only going to be populated if we actually use IDs. So this property is how we can go from IDs that are defined in that KV language and then reference them inside our Python code. So the name of the ID was options box, so let's refer to that. And like any widget in Kivy, we can call the add widget function here to add a child widget. And we simply need to pass the button that we defined above into that. And I'm now going to remove that comment. So basically we take the options box that we defined here inside the KV language, and then we're referring to that and we're calling add widget to add this button to the box layout. And that's going to happen for each option that we have in the questions. So for example, for this first question here, we're going to add a button for Berlin, for Madrid, for Paris and for Rome. So I want to actually show this now and we'll see what we actually have here. So let's save all of these files and see if this is working. Let's go to the terminal and we're going to run python main.py and let's see what appears on the screen, if anything. And this is loaded on my other screen. So again, let me drag this across. And now we have the question text at the top, and the question is, what is the capital of France? And we have each button appearing at the bottom. So that's one of the options for this question. And these are stacked vertically inside that box layout. So this layout here is mapped directly to the KV code. So I'm going to bring these side by side. So I know this user interface is looking a little bit weird at the moment, but basically we have the quiz screen, which is the root component. Underneath that, we have this simple label here that contains the label we see on the left-hand side. And notice the nesting here, we have the label, then the box layout as children of the quiz screen. That final box layout is what contains the 4 buttons. And the 4 buttons have not been added as part of the Kivy language, but they've been added inside main.py inside this load question method. So let me maximize this screen again. Let's customize this further by going back to the Kivy template file. And as well as orientation of vertical here, we can add things like padding. So let's do that just now. And I'm going to set a padding of 100 here. And let's save this. And I'm going to stop this application and we can reload Python main.py. And if we drag this across again, notice this is now looking a little bit better. We have more padding. And for example, the buttons at the bottom are not right against the bottom edge of this user interface. We have that padding available now. And that padding is applied to the root widget in this application, which is the quiz screen. So that's another example of one of the properties we can use here in the Kivy language. Now there are many of these, we cannot cover them all in this video, but there'll be links to the documentation below if you want to explore what's available. So what happens now? So if we go back to this application, let's say we wanted to select the correct answer here. When we click 𝗵𝗺, you can see that nothing really happens here. What we want to ideally show at the bottom is whether or not the user has answered this correctly, and then a button to allow them to move on to the next question. So let's start with the label that's going to be added to the bottom to tell the user if they've answered the question correctly. So we're going to need another label here. I'm going to copy this label and let's add another one just below the box layout, because this is going to be at the bottom of the page, and this is going to have the ID of answer text. So this is our UI element for the label. When the user selects the answer, we need to check now if that answer is correct. So what I'm going to do is save the .kv file and we're going to go back to main.py and let's define another method here called checkAnswer. And that's going to take self as a parameter, but it's also going to take another parameter here, and that's going to be the selected option. Now again, we're going to hard code this for now. Notice in the load question method, we hard coded it to question number 1. So let's copy this and we're going to check if that is correct here. So we're going to set a variable called correct, and we're going to again refer to the 0 index here, and we're going to get the answer from that. So let's explain what this is doing now and bring back questions.py. This is question number 1, and if we index into the answer key in that dictionary, we're going to get the correct answer. So what we want to do in this method here is we want to compare the selected option that the user's actually selected with the answer that we have here on 25, and we want to display a message depending on whether it's the correct answer or not. So let's set up an if statement here, and we're going to check the selected option that's been passed as an argument into this method is equal to the correct variable that we have above. And then we can set a variable here called message, and let's just simply say correct for now if that is a match. And then in the else block, we can set it to incorrect. Now the final part we want to do here is we want to take this label with the ID of answer text, and we want to add the text into that label conditionally, depending on whether the answer was correct or incorrect. So let's refer to that just now. And again, we're going to use that self.ids map that we have here. And this time the ID is answer text, and we can then set the .text property of that. Now remember, answer text here is referring to this, and this is a label widget which has a .text property, and we can set the text to the message that we have, and that message was what we set inside the conditional. Now this is not going to quite work at the moment, because what we need to do when the user actually clicks the button is we need to have an event that's going to call this function. So this is going to introduce events in Kivy. And by the way, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. I think it's Kivy, but if it's not, let me know in the comments. That's quite difficult to say in a Scottish accent, I will say that. Now what we're going to do at the moment is we're going to go back to the load question method. And let's get a bit of space here, because inside this for loop, what we're going to do after we create the button is we're going to create an event listener. And I say event listener, which is maybe more web terminology. What we're essentially going to do, if we go to the documentation on the event dispatcher, if we scroll down, notice that we have a method called bind. And this allows us to bind an event type or a property to a callback function. Now that's what we're going to do to our button. So let's load up VS Code, and we're going to use the button.bind method. And the event we're going to bind to is the onRelease event. And we can set up a Lambda function to handle that. Now the first argument is going to be the instance, and this refers to the button itself, and we're going to pass through the option that's been selected here, and we can set that to the option in the for loop here. And then the body of this Lambda function is simply going to call self.checkAnswer and pass through that option. So let's just go over this line one more time. For each button, we're binding the onRelease event to a Lambda function, and in each Lambda function we are passing in the option. And when the onRelease event is actually fired, we're going to call self.checkAnswer with the given option. Now let me just save this and let's reload the application at the bottom with Python main.py. And if we bring the application to the right hand side, let's select Paris and we get correct appearing at the bottom. And if we select Berlin or Madrid, we get incorrect. And this is now kind of working. So basically what happens when we click one of these buttons, it's calling this lambda function here that we defined for the button.bind method on the release event. And this lambda function is calling self.checkAnswer. And this function here is checking whether the answer is correct or not, and then adding that message to the answer text, which we defined in the .kv template file. Now one problem we have is that we want to have an actual quiz where we can move from one question to the next. So currently at the moment here, we cannot move from one question to the next. We're stuck on this question where we're asked what the capital of France is. So what I'm going to do in order to resolve this, if we go back to main.py and go to the top, is define a new property. And that's going to be a property called current question, and that's going to be a numeric property. So let's import numeric property from Kivy.properties. And then we can create another class variable here called current question, and we're going to set that to a numeric property. Now we want to default this to the very first index of the Python list, which is index 0. So let's set the default here to 0. And we can then use current question instead of hard coding this here. So let's change some stuff here inside load question. Instead of hard coding the 0 element, what we're going to do is refer to self.currentQuestion, and that's going to pull out the relevant question, and later on will allow users to move from question 0 to 1 and so on. And inside of check answer, we want to do exactly the same thing, so let's replace that 0 with self.currentQuestion. And we want to now create a next button so that when the user selects a question, or rather selects an answer, we get the next button that allows them to move on to the next question. So underneath this incorrect message, we want a button, and this is going to allow us to showcase some more advanced Kivy language functionality. So I want to create one more property in this class. So at the top from Kivy.properties, let's import Boolean property, and let's create a showNext variable here that's going to control whether that next button is actually shown. And that's going to be a Boolean property, and it's going to default to false. Now we want to add the button to the user interface, so let's go back to this file here. And underneath this label, we can add a button. Now the text is going to be quite simple. It's going to say next. And let's add an explicit height here of 100. And remember from before, we can say size hint y and set that to none if we want to explicitly set the height. And I'm going to add some other properties just to demonstrate how to do that. Let's give it a color of white, and that's going to be the text color. And we can also give it a background color as well with the background color option. And we're going to set that to blue. And here's something a bit more advanced. We're going to set an opacity, and we're going to set the opacity to 1 if root.showNext is set to true. Otherwise, we want the opacity to be 0, which means it will be hidden. So to explain this, let's look at root.showNext. Remember that root in this context is the quiz screen class, and this refers to our root widget here, and it's this class. And showNext is the property we added. We can refer to that, and if the property value is false, what that means is that the button is going to have opacity 0. But if root.showNext is set to true, we're going to set the opacity to 1. So again, this is how we can reference the value of a property inside of this KV language file. And the last thing we want to do just now in the check answer method that we have here, let's change the value of the showNext property when the user selects an answer. So we can set self.showNext to true. So that's going to be set to true when the user clicks one of the options that we have on this page. So let's close the application and clear the terminal, and we're going to rerun Python main.py, and let's see if this works. So I'm going to bring the application onto the page here. What is the capital of France? Let's say Paris, and we get correct, and notice this button appearing at the bottom. Now we can't actually click the button at the moment, so we need to now create a function to move to the next question. So again, I'm going to define a method on this class called nextQuestion that's going to take self as a parameter. And what we're going to do simply is increment self.currentQuestion. So we're going to add 1 to that. And what we also want to do when we move to the next question is we want to set self.showNext back to false so that the user has to answer the next question. And finally, what we can do after we've set the current question to the next value is we can call the loadQuestion method. And that is using that property here to get the correct question. So if we start at 0, it's going to load this question here, but when we increment that and recall the function, it's then going to load this question here. So let's go back down to our new method, and all we need to do is call self.loadQuestion. Now how do we call the next question method? Because we only defined this button inside of the KV language file. What we can actually do here is refer to the onRelease event as a property of the button. And again, we can call a method on the root, which is the quiz screen, and the method we're going to call is next question. So when that next button is pressed and the release happens, it's going to call root.nextQuestion, which refers to this method here. That's going to increment the question, set show next to false, and then load the next question. So let's finally test this out and rerun python main.py. And if we have this question here, let's select Madrid and we get incorrect. But when we click the next button, notice we are now loading some new stuff, but this does not look good. So why is this not working? What we need to do is remove the previous question when we move on to the next question. So let's go back to VS Code and we're going to look at the next question method. And what I'm going to do just before we call the other code is I'm going to call a method that we're going to define in a second called clear widgets. So when we navigate to the next question, we're going to clear the existing widgets. And we're going to define this inside a method because we are going to reuse this a little bit later in the video. So let's define the clear widgets method. And what do we actually need to clear here? So if we go back to the KV file, we need to clear the label for the previous question, and we also want to get rid of all of the previous options. And finally, we want to remove the answer text. Now for the question itself, this is actually going to be handled by the logic because the text is referring to this question text property that we set up in the class. So if we go back here, we have question text, and this is actually set by the load question method. But what we do need to do is we need to remove all of the options. So we're going to get the box layout with the ID of options box. Let's go back to main.py, and we used this before, but we're going to call a different method, not the add widget method. Instead, when we have this clear widgets method here, we're going to refer to that options box, and we're going to remove all of the child widgets within that to remove all of the existing options. We can do that using clear widgets, and then we can also refer to self.ids.answerText, and we can set the text for that to an empty string. So this answer text here refers to the label that we had telling the user whether their answer was correct or incorrect. We want to remove that when we navigate to the next question. So this is going to clear the options and clear that answer text, and we're calling that method when we navigate to the next question. So let's now test this out. I'm going to close what we had before and let's rerun python main.py. And we have the application on the screen now. If we select Paris here, that is correct, and we can navigate to the next question. And the next question, what is 2 plus 2? Let's select 3 for that. And surprisingly, that's incorrect. And we can now go to the next question. Now this is the last question. What planet is known as the red planet? So if we select the answer to that and we try and navigate to the next question, we get an exception. So if we look at the bottom here, we have an index error. The list index is out of range. So that's not ideal. What we want to do instead is show a page that tells the user that the quiz has been completed. But the good thing is that we now can actually navigate between the different questions in our quiz. And we have the current question numeric property controlling which one is shown. And we have this show next Boolean property. And this conditionally allows the user to move from one question to the next. And you can imagine if you're extending this application, you could also have a show previous Boolean property as well. So let's fix the error that we had at the end of the quiz. We're going to go to the next question method. Now when we go to the next page, we always want to clear the widgets no matter what. On the last page, we are going to clear them and show a quiz completed page. And we also always want to remove the show next button. So let's bring that up. And we're moving that above self.currentQuestion where we're incrementing this because this is not always going to be run. We're going to conditionally increment the current question only if there is an available next question. So what I'm going to do is add a simple if statement here, and we can tab this across. So if self.currentQuestion is less than the length of self.questions minus 1, only then do we increment self.currentQuestion, and only then are we going to call self.loadQuestion as well. So let's move that into the if statement. Otherwise, what we're going to do is create an else block here, and we're going to set self.questionText to a simple string that says quiz completed. Now let's clear the terminal and rerun python main.py. And we have the application now, and let's select Paris for this, and we're going to navigate through these questions. And finally, we get to the final page, and that final page says quiz completed. Not the most exciting final page. You could display a much more intuitive or a much nicer page than this, but it's going to do for this video. So that is our basic Kivy quiz app. What I want to do now, just to finish this video, is look at deploying to different platforms, for example, Android apps or iOS apps. But before we do that, it would be amazing if you like this content, give it a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the channel if you've found this useful. And consider buying the channel a coffee if you want to see more of this content. We have a link just below the video. And thank you very much to everybody who's supported the channel on Ko-fi so far. And we've also opened channel memberships. Check the button below if you want to join the channel and show your support. Now, to summarise what we've learned just very quickly, we've seen how to define Kivy widget classes, and we've seen how to run an application and also use the Kivy design language. And we also saw how to bind events and use Kivy properties to link class properties to our Kivy language widgets. And an example of that was the text here for this label, which referred to root.questionText. This is a property on the quiz screen, so we're referring to that inside our Kivy language file. Now there's lots more that we could explore here. For example, we could show a quiz summary at the end. How many questions did the user get wrong? How many did they get correct? And you could even show a chart. You could also add a timer to each question. For example, you've got 10 seconds to answer the question. If the time runs out, you've failed. And you could also add different question types and of course integrate a database behind the scenes. Lots of potential improvements to this application. So I'm going to put this code on GitHub. And if you want to extend this, I'd be really interested to see what you could create with Kivy. But I think creating a quiz application is a nice one to do as a starting point for this particular framework. And let's now finally move on and look at deploying to different platforms. So I'm going to go back to the home page here and back to the documentation. Now if we go to the sidebar on getting started, near the bottom here we have a page on packaging. So we have many examples here. We can create packages for Windows, for macOS, Android, iOS and so on. So let's have a look at a couple of these just now. For example, if we wanted to create a package for Android, there is a project called Python for Android. And this allows you to package your Python applications into binaries that can be run on Android devices. Let's have a quick look at that just now on GitHub. So you can turn your Python app into an Android APK, and that is what is used essentially to turn your Kivy application into something that can run on an Android device. And for new users, they recommend a tool called 𝗏𝗏. So that's the easiest way to make a full APK or AAB from a Kivy application for Android. And your Kivy applications can be released on an Android market such as the Play Store, with a few extra steps to create a fully signed Android app bundle. So you can check this page out. I'll leave a link to that, and 𝗏𝗏 as well is referenced in this page. If we go back and look at creating a package for iOS, you can see there are 4 steps for creating a package for iOS. You compile the distribution and then create an Xcode project, and then you can update the Xcode project and customize that project. Now for each one of these steps, you have instructions here in the documentation. For example, you can install the Kivy iOS package, and then run toolchain build Kivy in order to actually compile the distribution, and so on. Now I'm not going to go into all of this, it's a bit outside of the scope of this video, but this toolchain command line utility provided by Kivy iOS is really going to help you and guide you through the steps for getting a project onto iOS. So that's all for this video. I hope you've learned something about the Kivy framework for building cross-platform applications in Python. If you've enjoyed this content and you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page, linked below the video, and thanks again to everyone that's supported the channel. And if you have any requests for future content around frameworks like Kivy, let me know in the comments. And as I said earlier, if I've been pronouncing this wrong for the entire video, let me know in the comments as well. And thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next video.